Hello and welcome in. Whether we have spent many evenings together or this is your very first time stopping by, I am so glad you are here. Go ahead and get comfortable. Dim the lights. Pull the blanket up a little higher and let the room go quiet around you. Tonight, we are going to step back into the Middle Ages, traveling not to a battlefield, not to a throne room, but somewhere far more intimate. We are looking behind closed doors to discover what romance and courtship actually looked like centuries ago. From bizarre wooden barriers placed directly into a shared bed, to the surprisingly blunt negotiations that sealed a family's fate. The truth about medieval dating is a far cry from the fairy tales, and history class never told you any of this. So let us leave the modern world behind and see how two people actually found each other. To understand how two people found each other, we must first look at the light. The medieval day was strictly bounded by the sun, and the rhythms of human life were tethered to its arc. When dusk began to settle over the landscape, the heavy, relentless labor of the fields finally came to a halt. The rhythmic thud of the iron hoe, the creaking of wooden carts on rutted dirt paths, and the shouts of laborers calling to the oxen, all quieted as the shadows stretched long across the manorial lands. As the sky faded into flat, heavy shades of blue and gray, the transition from the demands of survival to the quiet hours of the evening began. For the vast majority of people, the peasants and serfs who worked the earth, the setting sun was a definitive boundary. Artificial light was a rare luxury. Pure beeswax candles burned clean and bright, but they were far too costly for common use, reserved primarily for the church altar or the wealthy lord's manor. Ordinary people relied on rushlights, dried reeds dipped in animal fat, or cheap tallow candles, which smoked heavily and smelled faintly of old meat. Because of this, most homes lived by the fading ambient light coming through small, unglazed windows, and the steady, low glow of the central hearth. The hearth was the anchor of the medieval home, a circle of warmth in a cold landscape. It was here that the evening meal was prepared, often a simple, thick pottage of oats, peas, and foraged greens, simmering in a heavy iron pot. The smell of wood smoke, boiling grain, and damp wool filled the small, single-room dwellings. It was in this narrow ring of firelight that the household gathered at the end of the day. A household was rarely just a private nuclear family. It frequently included extended relatives, an apprentice, or a hired agricultural hand, all sharing the same close quarters, breathing the same smoky air, and stepping around the same sleeping dogs or chickens brought inside for safety. Because the structure of daylight governed every waking hour of physical labor, the margins of the day were the only times left for personal connections. Courtship did not happen on the weekends because the modern concept of a weekend did not exist. Sunday was a day of rest from the fields, but it was occupied by mass, communal obligations, and chores that could not simply be ignored. Therefore, the quiet moments of the evening, when hands were busy mending leather straps or spinning wool by the fire, became the backdrop for observation. A young man might quietly watch how a young woman handled the wooden carding combs. She might observe his patience as he whittled a new peg for a plow. The medieval night was profoundly silent in a way the modern ear can scarcely comprehend. There was no hum of electricity, no distant roar of a highway, no glow of street lamps. Once the village livestock grew still and the wind died down, the silence was vast and heavy. In the winter months, this silence was paired with a deep, encroaching cold that seeped through the wattle and daub walls and rose up from the packed earth floors. In such a world, companionship was not merely a matter of romantic fulfillment. It was a simple, practical necessity. To face the dark and the cold alone was a formidable prospect. Two people pulling together meant shared body heat beneath rough, unwashed woolen blankets. It meant 4 hands instead of 2 to draw water from the frozen well, to weed the barley under the summer sun, and to gather enough firewood before the autumn frost set in. Marriage was primarily an economic unit of survival, a necessary defense against the quiet indifference of the seasons. Yet, within this strict framework of survival, the human desire for a preferred companion persisted. The young people of the village understood the stakes. They knew that whoever they chose, or whoever was chosen for them, would be the person they faced every long, silent evening with for the rest of their natural lives. And so, as the fire burned down to red embers, and the older generations began to nod off in the dimness, the subtle work of courtship began in the shadows. But the shadows of the evening hearth were only one part of this careful, quiet dance. when morning came, pulling the village from sleep in the pale, gray light before dawn, the quiet assessments continued. There were no formal arrangements to meet, no designated hours set aside strictly for romance. Instead, courtship was woven seamlessly into the heavy fabric of daily survival, playing out in the communal spaces where the work of living was done. Every morning required water, and the journey to the communal well was a fixed point in the rhythm of the day. Young women and men alike would make this walk, carrying heavy wooden buckets bound tightly with rusted iron hoops. The wood of these buckets was perpetually damp and slick, the iron cold against the fingers in the early morning chill. The path to the well was a familiar track of packed earth, sometimes wet with heavy dew, other times frozen into hard ruts. And it was here, along this simple dirt path, that people intentionally crossed ways. Drawing water was not a task that could be hurried. It required lowering a bucket deep into the stone-lined shaft, listening for the heavy, hollow slap of wood against water in the dark below, and then beginning the slow, steady work of turning the windlass to bring the load back to the surface. This rhythmic, repetitive labor created a natural, unforced space for conversation. While hands were occupied with the course, wet rope, eyes could meet. A few words could be exchanged over the damp stone rim of the well, spoken softly beneath the creaking of the wooden crank and the splashing of the water. The village was always watching, acting as a collective chaperone. Yet, the routine nature of the chore provided a shield of ordinary business. A lingering glance, or a quiet morning greeting here, was perfectly acceptable. A small allowance of intimacy before the demanding labor of the day truly began. As the morning wore on, the fields themselves became the primary ground for observing a potential partner. In a world where survival depended entirely on the harvest, physical capability and temperament were not abstract qualities to be guessed at. They were demonstrated openly, hour by hour. You did not learn about a person's character by asking them questions in a parlor. You learned by watching how they moved through a field, how they handled a heavy wooden rake, or how they spoke to the draft animals when the sun was high and the work was exhausting. This was never more apparent than during the autumn harvest, a time of intense, grueling effort when the entire village labored together to bring in the crops before the weather turned. The air in those late weeks of the year was thick with the dry, dusty smell of cut wheat, mingling with the rich, heavy scent of damp earth turned over by the plow. The days were relentlessly long. Muscles ached, and hands grew blistered and raw. Yet, even in this punishing environment, the subtle work of attraction went on. Young men and women worked in close proximity, moving down the long furrows to cut the stalks or gather the fallen grain into heavy sheaves. Across the rows of pale, golden wheat and sharp stubble, quiet glances were exchanged. The shared rhythm of the scythe and the sickle created a silent bond, a shared endurance of the autumn heat and the biting wind that followed, handing a rough woolen sack to another person, or passing a leather water skin down the line of weary workers, offered a fleeting moment of contact, the brief brush of calloused fingers, a tired nod of acknowledgement. These observations were deeply practical. A marriage in a medieval village was, at its core, an agricultural partnership. When a young man watched a young woman bind sheaves of wheat with steady, tireless hands, he was seeing the person who would help him survive the coming winter. When she watched him carry heavy loads of grain without complaint, she was assessing the quiet strength that would keep starvation from their door. The romance of the era was rooted firmly in the dirt, growing from a profound mutual reliance, forged in the fields long before any formal vows were spoken. This relentless rhythm of labor paused only once every 7 days. Sunday was the single reliable day of rest in the medieval calendar, a necessary exhalation in a life defined by physical exertion. On this morning, the heavy tools were left in the barns, and the aching muscles of the peasantry were granted a brief reprieve. People washed their faces and hands with cold water from a wooden basin, smoothing down their hair and donning their best tunics, garments that were perhaps just a shade cleaner, a bit less worn at the elbows than their daily work clothes. The walk to the parish church was a slow procession from the scattered farmsteads and village dwellings, drawing the entire community to a single central point. The churchyard was an anchor for both the living and the dead. As families approached, the damp air carried the distinct, sharp scent of old yew trees. These ancient evergreens were almost always planted among the graves. Their dark, dense needles providing a solemn canopy. The dropped foliage, softening the muddy paths beneath leather shoes. Mingled with the resinous smell of the yews was the cold, earthy odor of damp stone and the faint, chalky scent of lime wash from the church walls. Above them, the heavy bronze bells tolled, sending deep, rhythmic vibrations through the morning air, calling the parish to Mass and marking the boundary between the toil of the week and the quiet of the Sabbath. When the service concluded, the congregation did not simply scatter back to their hearths. The slow drift from the dim, incense-tinged interior of the nave out into the pale daylight of the churchyard was a deliberate, weekly ritual in itself. The deep porch of the church, a covered stone entryway, served as the primary civic hub of the village. It was a place sheltered from the rain and wind, where legal agreements were witnessed, minor disputes settled, and, most importantly for the future of the parish, where families lingered to observe one another. Here, beneath the archway, and out among the worn stone markers, the subtle social maneuvering of parents took place. Fathers and mothers gathered in quiet clusters, their conversations seemingly focused on the mundane. They spoke in low, measured tones about the changing weather, the yield of the recent harvest, or a neighbor's ailing livestock. Yet, beneath this ordinary chatter lay a current of careful calculation. They were watching the younger generation. A father might note the broad shoulders of a neighbor's son, assessing his capacity to pull a stubborn stump from the earth. A mother might observe the calm demeanor of a young woman, judging her ability to manage a hearth and a spinning whorl during the long, dark evenings. These were not romantic appraisals, but quiet negotiations of survival, conducted through polite nods and meaningful silences. While the elders stood in their tight, authoritative circles, the youth positioned themselves just at the edges of earshot. They remained close enough to respect the strict boundaries set by their watchful chaperones, but far enough away to carve out a small margin of their own space. Courtship here was a matter of careful geometry. A young man might stand leaning against the rough bark of a yew tree, his eyes tracking a young woman as she adjusted her woolen shawl against the damp breeze. There were no grand declarations, no private walks in the woods. Such things would invite ruinous gossip and damage a family standing. Instead, there was the prolonged, quiet observation of someone you had likely known since childhood, seen now through the shifting lens of impending adulthood. Introductions and interactions were a masterclass in understatement. A mother might bridge the gap by calling her daughter over to pass a wrapped bundle of herbs to a young man's aunt. A father might make a point to ask a young man a question about a stray sheep, drawing him into the family's circle for just a few moments. These interactions were brief, heavily supervised, and utterly ordinary on the surface. Yet, in the shared glance over a bundle of dried mint, or the slight shifting of feet on the damp earth, careful measures were taken. It was a deeply pragmatic choreography, played out week after week against the backdrop of the parish graves. The young men and women stood above the resting places of their ancestors, quietly evaluating the partnerships that would eventually produce the next generation. As the final echoes of the bells faded into the surrounding fields, and the chill of the afternoon began to settle into their woolen layers, the families would finally begin to drift apart, walking slowly back to their cottages, carrying with them new, unspoken understandings of who might soon be joining their family line. In these quiet evaluations made on the walk home, the modern concept of romantic chemistry was largely absent, replaced by a deep, enduring practicality. Attraction in the medieval village was rooted not in troubadour poetry or delicate, symmetrical features, but in the visible capacity for labor. The landscape they inhabited was unforgiving, and the people who worked it understood that survival required a partner who would not simply share their bed, but share the heavy, relentless burden of their daily existence. A sturdy constitution was considered the highest form of beauty. Broad shoulders, thick waists, and strong legs were the markers of someone who could pull a cart out of the spring mud, haul heavy buckets of water from the communal well, and survive the brutal chill of a poor harvest. Calloused hands were never something to be hidden or softened. They were a testament to reliability, an assurance of capability. The rough, cracked texture of a palm, hardened by years of gripping a scythe or kneading dense rye dough, signaled a partner who would not break under the weight of peasant life. Even strong, intact teeth were carefully noted, as the medieval diet of coarse bread and fibrous vegetables demanded a jaw capable of grinding through tough meals year after year. Courtship, therefore, was often a silent act of observation, watching a potential match move through their chores. A young man might quietly study the way a woman handled a brewing vat. He would note the sour, yeasty smell of her woolen skirts and the efficiency with which she managed the heavy wooden paddles, turning soaked barley into the weak ale that provided crucial calories for the household. Her skill with the drop spindle or the heavy wooden loom, the steady, rhythmic clack of the shuttle, weaving raw wool into warm cloth, held far more allure than a quick wit or a pleasing singing voice. Her ability to mend, to brew, and to preserve food meant the difference between comfort and starvation when the snows finally came. A woman, in turn, watched how a man handled his tools and his livestock. The straightness of the furrow he cut into the dark, damp earth with the heavy plow spoke volumes about his physical strength and his focus. She would notice if his leather boots were kept mended, if he could butcher a pig cleanly and calmly in the autumn frost, or if he possessed the raw stamina to thresh wheat on the dusty barn floor from dawn until dusk. To find these qualities deeply appealing was not a lack of romance. It was a profound, grounded understanding of what life required. A marriage was, at its very core, a small economic enterprise. The two individuals were halves of a single, functioning unit of labor. Medieval sermons frequently compared a married couple to two oxen pulling a plow. If one was weak, or if they pulled in different directions, the furrow would be ruined and the crop would fail. The heavy reliance on one another to keep the hearth fire burning, the grain harvested, and the children fed created a bond that was less about passionate infatuation and more about an intimacy forged in shared, routine exhaustion. The smell of wood smoke, old wool, and damp earth permeated these working partnerships. When winter set in and the days grew agonizingly short, a couple's survival depended entirely on the preparations they had made together. In the warmer months, the sight of a partner stacking split ash logs against the wattle and daub wall, or carefully turning salted pork in the cold pantry, brought a sense of deep, settling comfort. This was the true face of medieval attraction, a quiet, heavy appreciation for the person who would stand beside you in the mud and the frost, year after year, keeping the cold and the hunger at bay. As November settled over the parish, the soft, yielding mud of the village tracks began to change. The deep ruts carved by ox carts and wooden barrows during the autumn rains froze in the night, turning into hard, jagged ridges that crunched beneath leather shoes. The mornings grew pale and brittle. Frost coated the thatch of the roofs, a thick, glittering rime that melted only briefly at midday before the shadows lengthened and the chill returned. The world shrank, pulling inward from the fields and the pastures, retreating to the small, enclosed spaces of the village. The encroaching frost dictated the rhythm of every day, turning the simple act of staying warm into a continuous, quiet labor. Inside the rural cottage, the reality of winter was absolute. The central hearth, often just a stone-lined depression in the middle of the packed earth floor, became the anchor of existence. But firewood was a precious commodity, gathered with great effort from the common woods, or purchased at a premium. It could not be burned wastefully. The fire was kept banked, a glowing mound of peat, or carefully managed hardwood embers, providing enough heat to simmer a pot of pottage, but rarely enough to warm the far corners of the room. A family would sit close, mending tools, or spinning wool in the dim, smoky light, their fronts baking while their backs remained cold. The walls of the cottage, built of woven hazel hurdles slathered with a mixture of clay, animal dung, and straw, were thick but imperfect. Over the years, the dried daub would crack, and despite the diligent patching done in the late summer, biting drafts always found a way through. The moment one stepped away from the immediate radius of the hearth, the air was shockingly cold. A film of ice might form on the surface of a water bucket left by the door overnight. The damp chill seeped into woolen tunics and linen shifts, settling deep into the joints. The smell of the winter cottage was heavy and layered a mixture of wood smoke, unwashed wool, stored onions, and the sharp, metallic scent of the freezing air pressing against the timber frame. In an era long before central heating, and in homes where thick woven blankets were expensive and therefore scarce, warmth was a communal resource. The simple, undeniable need to share body heat shaped the way people lived and slept. Beds, whether they were raised wooden frames strung with rope, or simple straw pallets laid upon the floor, were rarely occupied alone. Siblings, parents, and sometimes even traveling laborers slept side by side, pooling their warmth covers they possessed. The human body is a slow furnace, radiating a steady, vital heat, and in the freezing dark of a medieval January, the proximity of another living, breathing person was not just a comfort, but a matter of daily survival. This desperate need for warmth naturally extended into the local rituals of courtship. When a young man came to call on a winter evening, he could not be expected to stand outside in the frost, nor could the family afford to build a second fire, simply to give the young couple privacy in another room. The architecture of the cottage and the scarcity of fuel forced a pragmatic kind of intimacy. Courtship happened within the small, warm circle of the hearth, often with the rest of the household sitting just a few feet away, listening to the wind rattle, the wooden shutters. The physical closeness required simply to keep from shivering created a quiet, domestic space where a couple could speak in low voices, their shoulders brushing, bound together by the enclosing cold. As the evening wore on, the fire would eventually burn low, reducing the hearth to a bed of glowing, quiet embers. Firewood was a precious resource, carefully gathered and rationed against the long winter months, and no family could afford to burn extra logs simply to allow two young people to continue a conversation. Yet the need for a couple to speak privately, to test their compatibility, and share their quiet thoughts remained. The practical solution to this problem of cold and economy was a custom known as bundling. It allowed a courting couple to share the warmth of a bed through the freezing night, while strict physical boundaries were maintained to preserve their reputations and the honor of the household. In many homes, this boundary took the very literal form of a bundling board. When the time came to retire, the family would prepare the bed, placing a smooth, heavy plank of wood firmly down the center of the mattress. This board was often a dedicated piece of household furniture, crafted from oak or pine, its edges sanded smooth by years of use so as not to catch on the woolen bedclothes. Sometimes it slotted into specific grooves built into the headboard and footboard, creating a solid, unyielding timber barrier that divided the mattress into two distinct halves. It was a simple, architectural approach to morality, transforming a shared piece of furniture into two separate, parallel beds. The couple would lie side by side, on their respective sides of the board, remaining entirely fully clothed. They wore their thick woolen stockings, their heavy linen undergarments, and often their day clothes, simply removing their outer boots or cloaks. Separated by the sturdy plank of wood, they could turn their heads to look at one another in the dim light of the dying fire, or speak softly into the dark. The wood was a constant physical reminder of the rules of their courtship. A hard edge pressing against a shoulder or a hip if they drifted too close to the center of the mattress. Yet it also provided a quiet, sanctioned space where they could speak for hours, uninterrupted by the waking chores of the day. In some households, or perhaps for couples who required a more thorough assurance of propriety, a bundling sack was used instead of, or alongside, the wooden board. This was a large, heavy bag made of rough canvas or thick linen, akin to a grain sack, but scaled to hold a person. One of the courting pair, usually the young woman, would climb inside the sack, fully dressed. The top of the bag would then be drawn closed and tied securely around her waist, or sometimes entirely up to her neck, fastened with sturdy knots that could not easily be undone from the inside. Encased in the heavy canvas, movement was severely restricted, reducing the sleeper to a quiet, wrapped bundle. It was a deeply practical garment, ensuring that no sudden shift in the night could lead to an accidental entanglement. Over the bundled couple, the rest of the household would pile heavy woolen blankets and thick quilts to trap the body heat. These blankets carried the deep, earthy sense of the home, the rich, oily smell of natural lanolin from the sheep's wool, layered with the lingering, sharp scent of wood smoke that settled over everything in a medieval dwelling. The combined weight of the clothing, the canvas sack, and the dense woolen covers was substantial. It pressed down firmly on the couple, a heavy, comforting pressure in the stark cold of the unheated sleeping quarters. Outside the thick covers, the air in the room might be cold enough to freeze water in a wash basin by morning. But beneath the blankets, insulated by layers of wool and the sturdy barrier of the bundling board, the space was warm and still. It was an environment built entirely around endurance and practical comfort, allowing two people to learn the cadence of each other's voices in the long, dark stretch of the night, safely anchored beneath the heavy blankets, while the winter wind blew against the walls outside. Yet, for all the warmth trapped within that small woolen world, they were never truly alone. The typical medieval peasant dwelling was a single, continuous space, a room where the entirety of a family's domestic life unfolded from birth until death. There were no corridors, no private chambers, and no internal doors to close against the rest of the household. The darkness of the winter night provided the only real curtain, drawing a heavy, shadow-filled veil over the room. Once the central hearth had burned down to a low, quiet bed of embers. In this shared space, the bundling couple occupied just one small corner of a much broader tapestry of sleep. The air in the room would have been thick with the familiar sense of daily survival. The lingering acrid tang of wood smoke, the smell of damp wool drying near the stones, and the faint, earthy odor of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Only a few feet away from the courting couple, the parents rested in their own bed, or perhaps upon thick pallets of straw, stuffed into coarse linen sacks. The physical proximity was absolute. In a timber-framed house with walls of wattle and daub, every small sound was magnified in the stillness of the night. Every shift of weight on a wooden frame, every rustle of dry rushes beneath a mattress, echoed clearly in the cold air. To court in such a house meant accepting that romance was a highly public, or at least deeply familial, affair. The parents, though they might turn their faces toward the plaster wall and close their eyes, were rarely entirely asleep during these visits. They lay in the quiet dark, attuned to the subtle, shifting noises of the room. They listened to the steady rhythm of the young couple's breathing, taking silent measure of the cadence of their voices and the length of the pauses between their words. A steady, murmured exchange of conversation was reassuring, a sign that the boundaries of the bundling board were being respected and that the mind was engaged rather than the body. Sudden, prolonged silences or the heavy shifting of blankets might prompt a father to clear his throat in the darkness. A gentle but firm reminder that the house was watchful. Beyond the parents, there were usually younger siblings to consider. Small children were often clustered together for warmth on pallets near the fading hearth. Their soft, even breathing adding to the rhythmic texture of the room's soundscape. The courting couple had to keep their voices pitched to the lowest of whispers, a quiet murmur exchanged in the dark, so as not to wake the sleeping children. This acoustic necessity forced a kind of immediate physical intimacy. They had to lean their heads close together on the bolster, speaking directly into each other's ears. They whispered about the day's chores, the gossip of the village, the spinning that needed to be done, or their prospects for a land tenancy in the coming spring. It was an unvarnished exchange of realities, stripping away any pretense as they negotiated the heavy, practical responsibilities that a marriage would demand. This supervised intimacy was an elegant, if rigid, compromise born of pure necessity. In a society where firewood was labor-intensive to gather, and winter nights were bitterly, dangerously cold, lighting a separate fire for a courting couple was an unthinkable waste of precious resources. Sending them out into the freezing dark was equally impossible. Allowing them into the house and into a bed, securely bound by layers of clothing, the wooden board, and the auditory surveillance of the entire family, was simply the most sensible solution available. It preserved the social order and protected the reputation of the household, while still allowing two young people the quiet time they needed to determine if they could tolerate each other's company for a lifetime. In a world with so little physical space, this quiet, closely monitored proximity was the closest thing to privacy they would ever know. Once the quiet hours of monitored proximity came to an end, the space between two young people was once again filled with the endless chores and obligations of the medieval day. To bridge this distance, courtship relied heavily on the exchange of simple, tangible objects. These were not grand gestures or expensive jewels, but quiet things made by hand or found in the damp earth, carrying the weight of time and attention. In a village where everyone knew everyone else's business, a small token could be passed from one hand to another with barely a break in the rhythm of the harvest or the market day. During the long, dark stretches of the winter months, when the fields were frozen and the days were brief, families spent their evenings gathered close around the central hearth. In this dim, smoky light, a young man might pull a piece of seasoned fruitwood from the pile and begin the slow work of whittling. Using a small, sharp knife, he would carefully shape the bowl and the handle of a wooden spoon, letting the pale shavings fall onto the hard-packed dirt floor. This was unhurried work. Night after night, would smooth the grain, perhaps carving a simple geometric pattern or a rough shape into the handle. The spoon was deeply practical, a tool for eating pottage or stirring a pot. But the hours of quiet labor poured into its making transformed it into a clear statement of intent. It spoke of a readiness to provide and of the building of a future shared household. Other tokens were even simpler, requiring only a sharp eye or a few copper coins saved over many seasons. A smooth, heavy river stone, polished over centuries by the current, might be picked up from the mud and slipped into a pouch to be given later. A young woman who spent her days spinning flax might receive a beautifully carved wooden bobbin, its smooth edges designed to keep the yarn from snagging. Or, when a traveling peddler brought his pack of wares to the village green, a suitor might purchase a single length of brightly dyed ribbon. The vibrant red or deep blue wool, colored with madder or woad, stood out sharply against the drab, undyed linens of everyday working clothes. It was a tiny luxury, something to be woven into a braid on a feast day or tied around a wrist. Sometimes the tokens moved in the other direction, requiring an entirely different kind of labor. A young woman might present her suitor with a pair of thick, knitted woolen stockings. The process of making them was immense. The wool had to be sheared, washed in the river to remove the heavy grease, carded until the fibers lay flat, spun into yarn on a drop spindle, and finally worked by the firelight. To give such a garment was to give weeks of one's own time. The stockings offered profound physical comfort against the biting damp of the medieval winter, holding the warmth of the sheep and the warmth of the hearth against the wearer's skin. It was an intimate gift, meant to be worn beneath heavy tunics and leather boots, yet completely respectable in its deep practicality. These small objects were not put on display. They were kept quietly, tucked away where they would not draw the teasing of siblings or the sharp reprimands of parents. A carved spoon might be wrapped in a scrap of plain linen and stored in the bottom of a heavy wooden chest at the foot of a bed. A polished stone or a length of ribbon might be carried deep in a pocket. A hard, smooth weight that could be touched with the fingertips during the long hours of pulling weeds or mending fences. In a culture where marriage was so often a matter of property, survival, and negotiation, these quiet tokens served as their own kind of contract. were unspoken promises, resting silently in the dark, tethering two people together through the slow, repetitive labor of their daily lives. Beyond the open fields and the quiet isolation of rural life, a different rhythm of courtship was taking shape behind the heavy stone walls of the growing medieval towns. Here, the vast expanse of the agricultural landscape gave way to narrow, winding cobblestone streets. The sky, rather than an unbroken dome from horizon to horizon, was sliced into thin, irregular ribbons by the overhanging eaves of timber-framed houses. In these dense urban centers, space was a premium, and privacy was almost entirely non-existent. People lived closely, stacked together in tall buildings, their daily routines overlapping in a constant hum of commerce and survival. Courtship in the town was not a matter of quiet moments at the edge of a field, but rather a negotiation of crowded spaces and constant, watchful eyes. The town square was the beating heart of this shared life, serving as both a marketplace and a social stage. It was an environment defined by its overwhelming mingling of scents and sounds. On any given morning, the heavy, comforting aroma of baking bread from the communal ovens would drift across the paving stones, mixing with the rich smoke of roasting meats from the cookshops. Beneath these warmer smells lay the harsher realities of urban industry, such as the sharp, acrid tang of the tanneries situated near the river, or the metallic bite of the smithies. Young men and women moved through this sensory landscape daily, fetching water, purchasing provisions, or delivering goods. It was in these routine crossings that glances were exchanged, and the slow, tentative steps of urban courtship began. Much of this looking happened from above. The architecture of the medieval town naturally created a tiered society of observation. Along the bustling streets, apprentices and journeymen spent their daylight hours working at benches situated near the open shutters of second-story workshops. These large, unglazed windows were necessary to let in the sunlight for detailed work with leather, cloth, or metal, but they also provided a perfect vantage point. An apprentice could pause in his labor, tools resting idle in his hands, for just a moment, to watch the flow of people passing in the street below. A young woman carrying a basket of spun wool, or a servant running an errand for her household, might look up catching the eye of the young man in the window. These fleeting visual connections were the urban equivalent of a shared glance across a village green, brief, but highly deliberate. Yet, for the young men looking down from those windows, acting on such an attraction was a complicated matter, heavily restricted by the strict rules of the trade guilds. An apprentice was not a free agent. When a boy's parents signed his indentures, binding him to a master craftsman for a term that often lasted 7 long years, they essentially handed over total control of his life. The guild charters were explicit and unyielding in their regulations, and one of the most universal rules was the absolute prohibition of marriage during the term of apprenticeship. The logic was purely economic and practical. A master required an apprentice's undivided attention, his labor from sunrise to sunset, and his residence within the master's own household. A wife and a family of his own would be a distraction, a drain on meager resources, and a premature step toward setting up a rival shop. If an apprentice was found to have married secretly, the consequences were severe. He could be stripped of his position, expelled from the guild, and lose any hope of ever practicing his trade legally within the town walls. Therefore, courtship for these young men was an exercise in extreme patience. They might court a woman for years, waiting out the clock on their indentures. Often, the geography of their affection was confined to the master's house itself. It was entirely common for an apprentice to quietly court a domestic servant working in the same home, or, if he was particularly favored, the master's own daughter. Marrying the master's daughter was a well-worn path to securing a future within the guild, though it required years of careful, respectful behavior under the master's constant scrutiny. For those who found love outside the household, the relationship had to be sustained through brief encounters in the marketplace. Messages passed through willing intermediaries, and a shared understanding of the long wait ahead. Urban courtship was measured not by the turning of the agricultural seasons, but by the slow progression from apprentice to journeyman, and perhaps eventually to master. Only when a man had completed his training, secured steady wages, and gained the approval of his guild could he finally step into the church to publish the banns of marriage. Until then, the romance lived in the quiet spaces between the tolling of the town bells, in the shared glances from a second-story window, and in the steady, rhythmic scrape of tools against wood and leather, marking the slow passage of time. When that slow passage of time finally brought the sun below the rooflines, the rhythm of the town shifted. The workshops shuttered. The market stalls were dismantled, and the evening chill settled over the narrow streets. For the working men and women of the town, the natural destination at this hour was the local alehouse. It was a place defined by its reliable warmth, drawing in apprentices, journeymen, market girls, and domestic servants who had spent the daylight hours working in damp rooms or exposed to the wind. Inside, the air was thick and heavy. It smelled of wood smoke, yeast, roasting meat, and wet wool drying slowly near the central hearth. Illumination came from the fire itself and from sputtering tallow candles stationed on tables around the room. These candles, made of rendered animal fat, gave off a distinct, slightly greasy odor and a low, wavering yellow light that left the corners of the tavern draped in deep, forgiving shadow. Patrons found their places on rough-hewn wooden benches, the timber worn smooth and dark by years of friction from coarse woolen tunics and heavy linen skirts. Drink was served in heavy wooden tankards or stitched leather jacks, passed from the barkeep's hands to the waiting patrons. The ale they drank was not the strong, clear beverage of later centuries, but a weak, cloudy brew, thick with suspended yeast and slightly sweet to the taste. It was sustenance as much as refreshment, providing cheap calories after a day of heavy labor. It was common for a young man to purchase a tankard and offer a sip to a young woman he had noticed across the room. This small, shared ritual was an accepted opening to conversation, a quiet negotiation of interest over the rim of a battered wooden cup. The alehouse was invariably crowded, but this lack of physical space, paradoxically, provided a kind of privacy. The room was filled with a steady, continuous hum, the overlapping sounds of dozens of conversations, the clatter of wooden trenchers, the scrape of boots on the packed earth floor, and the crackle of the hearth. This blanket of noise was dense and unbroken for a young couple sitting side by side on a bench, leaning in close to hear one another. This wall of sound meant that their words traveled no further than the space between them. They could speak with a frankness that would have been impossible in the quiet confines of a shared workshop or a crowded family home. Here, the strict supervision of the daylight hours naturally relaxed, while aristocratic daughters were closely guarded in their manners. The working youth of the town enjoyed a practical freedom born of necessity. A seamstress who had spent the day straining her eyes over needlework, or a baker's daughter who had been hauling sacks of flour, could sit freely beside a tanner's apprentice or a stonemason. They talked of the day's wages, the mood of the guild masters, the price of grain, and the changing seasons. Their courtship was woven directly into these mundane complaints and their shared exhaustion. There were no grand declarations in the alehouse, only the gradual accumulation of familiarity. A young man might trace a pattern in the spilled ale on the tabletop while he spoke, his shoulder brushing against hers as someone squeezed past them in the narrow aisle. The warmth of the room, the slight dulling of the days, aches from the ale, and their proximity on the bench created a space where practical attachments could form slowly. They learned how the other person sounded when they were tired, how carefully they handled a meager coin purse, and whether they were prone to quiet contemplation or easy conversation. When the town watch eventually called the curfew and the hearth fire burned down to glowing embers, the patrons would spill out into the dark, cold streets. The young men and women would walk back to their respective lodgings, their clothes carrying the smell of the smoke and the yeast. The evening usually offered no formal promises, only the quiet assurance of another meeting the following night, taking their customary places on the same hard bench in the familiar, smoky warmth of the room. While the tavern offered a space for the laboring classes to find companionship in the evenings, courtship took a decidedly different shape in the homes of the rising merchant class. Here, the search for a spouse was less about shared time on a wooden bench and more about the careful alignment of futures, resources, and trade networks. The bustling streets outside might have been full of casual glances and fleeting interactions, but inside the merchant's home, the atmosphere was measured, quiet, and deeply pragmatic. Marriage in these circles was a serious enterprise, a joining of two businesses as much as two people, requiring a clear head and a steady hand. The heart of this process was often the counting house, a room usually situated at the front of the merchant's dwelling or just behind a busy shop floor. It was a space defined by order and quiet concentration. The air in these rooms carried a very specific scent, a dry, dusty mingling of iron gall ink, stretched parchment, and the sweet, heavy aroma of melting beeswax used for stamping seals. Light filtered in through small, diamond-paned windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing above sturdy oak tables. There were no roaring hearths or spilled ale here, only the steady scratching of a quill and the soft rustle of heavy pages turning. It was in this subdued environment their daughter's future was often decided, negotiated in low voices over the table. When a potential suitor was considered, a father did not primarily look for poetic charm or a handsome face, though such things were not entirely unwelcome if they happened to be present. The evaluation was far more systematic. A young man's worth was measured by his access to lucrative trade routes, his family's standing in the wool markets of Flanders, or his connections to the merchants bringing pepper and cinnamon from the east, a suitor whose uncle controlled a fleet of trading cogs, or who held a favorable position in a local guild, was instantly more appealing. Courtship at this stage was essentially a series of quiet inquiries, letters sent by courier to verify debts and assets, and careful conversations over cups of imported wine. For the young woman, this meant her prospective husband was chosen for his ability to ensure her financial stability and to elevate her family's standing in the city. She might be introduced to him in the parlor, under the watchful eye of her mother or an older aunt, where they would exchange polite greetings and perhaps share a small meal of salted fish, bread, and honey. The conversation would be cordial, touching on the weather, the recent arrival of ships in the harbor, or the quality of a new bolt of cloth. There was no expectation of immediate passion. Affection was something that was expected to grow over time, cultivated like a steady, reliable crop long after the contracts were signed and the households merged. The finalization of these arrangements was recorded not in poetry, but in the ledger. The merchant's ledger was a thick, heavy book, bound in pale calfskin and reinforced with brass corners, designed to survive decades of daily use and constant handling. Inside, in neat, sloping script, a father would methodically document the exact terms of the dowry. A typical entry might note the promise of 200 silver coins to be paid over 3 years, a set of silver spoons, a heavy feather bed, 6 brass cooking pots, and a share in the profits of the next season's grain harvest. These marital promises were written directly alongside the mundane business of the day. A page in the ledger might list a shipment of rye from the Baltic coast, followed by the purchase of 20 barrels of salted herring, and immediately below that, the transfer of linens and coin to a new son-in-law. There was no distinction made between the commerce of the warehouse and the commerce of the household. Everything was a matter of household economy, carefully weighed, measured, and committed to paper, ensuring that the union rested on a foundation as solid and verifiable as the merchant's own trade. Once the ink dried, the book would be closed with a heavy clasp. The matter settled, while the merchant locked his agreements in heavy ledger books. The rural village relied on a different kind of record keeper. In the sprawling networks of farming communities and scattered hamlets, the matchmaker held the role of both diplomat and human archive. She was very often an older widow, having survived the heavy demands of childbearing and the back-breaking agricultural labor of her youth. She now possessed a vast, quiet knowledge of local lineages, hidden debts, and the precise boundaries of land holdings stretching across the parish. She carried this catalogue of village life entirely in her memory. She knew which families suffered from a generational weakness in the chest when the damp winter weather set in, which farmer had quietly mortgaged his lower pasture to survive a bad harvest, and which daughter had a quick temper but an unusually tireless work ethic. Her work was rarely formal. There was no painted sign above her door declaring her profession. Instead, her trade was woven seamlessly into the daily rhythms of the village, masked by the ordinary chores of survival. When she visited a home to begin brokering an arrangement, she did not arrive empty-handed, nor did she announce her intentions at the door. She might appear at the threshold carrying a heavy woven basket of mending, or perhaps a distaff and a spindle, offering to sit and help turn the household's raw wool into yarn. By occupying her hands with domestic routine, she made her presence unremarkable and entirely unthreatening. She would take a stool by the hearth, her spindle dropping and twirling with a steady, hypnotic rhythm, blending the quiet, continuous hum of the spinning wool with the the slow cadence of her conversation. It was beside the fire, amid the scent of wood smoke, dried herbs, and roasting root vegetables, that she began her subtle work. She did not speak directly of marriage at first. The approach was meandering, designed to test the waters without causing a ripple. She might mention the changing weather, the price of oats at the distant market town, and then, quite casually, drop a hint about a neighbor's son. She would murmur, almost as an afterthought, that the young man in question had recently acquired a rather fine plot of grazing land near the river, land that caught the early morning sun and grew thick, rich grass perfect for fattening spring lambs. She watched the reactions of the parents closely in the firelight as she spun her yarn. A slight nod, a thoughtful pause in the mother's own mending, or a long gaze into the embers, told the matchmaker that the seed of the idea had taken root. If the reception was cold, or the silence too heavy, she would gently steer the conversation back to the dampness in the thatch, or the health of the village sheep, leaving no embarrassment or formal rejection in her wake. Her method allowed families to explore possibilities and gauge prospects without ever committing their pride. If there was genuine interest, her task shifted to the delicate, persistent negotiation of social boundaries. Many village families carried quiet grudges that spanned generations. A dispute over a strayed cow from decades past, a misunderstood insult at a festival, or a lingering resentment over a diverted stream. The matchmaker acted as a soothing balm on these old, localized wounds. She would gently remind the feuding parties of the practical, undeniable benefits of an alliance, pointing out how a marriage could cleanly merge two adjacent fields, or bring a strong, capable set of working hands into a household that desperately needed them for the autumn harvest. Through quiet persistence and an endless supply of patience, she smoothed over the jagged edges of village politics. She wove families together much like she spun her wool, drawing disparate, sometimes tangled threads into a single, durable line. Her payment for this vital service was rarely a formal fee in silver coin. It might be a thick cut of cured bacon, a heavy sack of finely milled flour, or simply an honored seat near the high table at the eventual wedding feast. There she would sit quietly, eating well, watching the new couple, and making careful mental notes about the younger siblings who would soon need her quiet visits by the fire. Long before that feast could take place, however, the foundation of the new household had to be laid. Once the matchmaker had made her quiet introductions, and the two families agreed to meet, the real work began. Picture a low-ceilinged room filled with the smell of wood smoke, dried herbs, and damp wool. The two families sit across from each other at a scarred wooden table. It is a heavy piece of furniture, worn smooth at the edges by generations of resting elbows, scraped trenchers, and spilled ale. There is no talk of romance here. The conversation is measured, plain, and focused entirely on the practical mechanics of survival. In a world where a single poor harvest meant a winter of hunger, and a damp summer could rot the wheat in the fields, a marriage was not a joining of souls so much as a crucial economic merger. The parents speak quietly, but firmly, looking each other in the eye across the timber boards. They are building a business, a shared enterprise of hearths, woven cloth, and agricultural labor. Sentimentality has no place at this table. Affection between the young couple might grow in time, fostered by shared work and shared fires. But today, the parents are concerned only with what can be weighed, counted, and sown. The negotiations naturally center on the dowry, the portion of wealth the bride will bring to her new home. It is counted out with precise, deliberate care. A father might promise a heavy brass cooking pot, an item of immense value that will outlast them all, passing down to future daughters and granddaughters. He speaks of 3 good linen sheets, woven during long winter evenings by the fireside, their fibers thick, unbleached, and strong. Along with these household goods, there might be a small leather pouch set upon the table, containing a careful measure of silver coins, saved over years of selling excess grain or honeycomb at the distant market town. Then comes the clinical valuation of the livestock. A dairy cow is not simply an animal. She is a vital engine of daily calorie production. The fathers lean forward, resting their forearms on the scarred wood, discussing the cow in granular detail. They speak of her age, the richness of her milk, her temperament in the milking stall, and her history of calving. A cow that yields thick, creamy milk for butter and hard cheese can mean the difference between a family thriving or merely scraping by during the lean, cold months of early spring. The conversation eventually shifts to a small flock of sheep. The groom's family asks frank, unvarnished questions about the animal's health. They want to know the weight of the fleeces yielded at the last shearing, whether the wool is fine or coarse, and if the flock has ever suffered from foot rot or the damp coughs that can quickly decimate a pasture. There is no insult taken at these questions. It is simply the way of things. The bride's father answers plainly, perhaps offering a slightly older ewe as a concession to finalize the agreement. The groom's side must also make their promises clear. They outline the dower, the specific lands, rights, or income the bride will be entitled to if she outlives her husband, a very real possibility in a world of physical labor and sudden fevers. The men discuss the acreage of the fields the young man will inherit, the clay or chalk quality of the soil, the condition of the iron-tipped plow, and the state of the thick thatch on the cottage roof. Every timber, every iron nail, every bushel of seed corn is brought to the light and weighed in the balance of the new family's future. When all the goods have been tallied and the livestock thoroughly assessed, the agreement is finally struck. It is not sealed with a kiss or a sweeping declaration, but with a firm clasp of calloused hands across the table, and perhaps the pouring of a single wooden cup of hard cider, passed from hand to hand among the parents. The young couple, who may have been sitting quietly by the hearth, listening to the inventory of their future lives, now know exactly what they have to build upon. They are called forward from the warmth of the fire to stand before the heavy oak table, taking their places beside their parents. The air in the room, thick with the smell of wood smoke, damp wool, and the lingering scent of the evening meal, feels suddenly still. The parents step back slightly, allowing the two young people to face each other in the dim, flickering light of the hearth. They are instructed to join their right hands. This physical connection is the handfasting, a term that carries a certain romantic weight in modern times. But in the medieval village, it is a matter of strict and binding legal utility. The clasp is firm, palm against palm, feeling the familiar rough texture of skin that has spent years pulling weeds, tending livestock, and spinning coarse yarn. It is a very ordinary touch that suddenly carries the entire weight of their future. While their hands are joined, they must speak the necessary words. The phrasing is simple, spoken in their own local dialect, rather than the Latin of the church, so that there can be no misunderstanding among the witnesses. They must use words of the present tense, declaring that they take each other as husband and wife here and now, rather than promising to do so at some vague point in the future. Once these present tense words are spoken aloud, while hands are clasped, the betrothal is legally binding in the eyes of the community, and indeed the law. They are effectively married from this moment forward, even if the church blessing and the physical consummation will wait for a later date. Breaking this contract now would require the intervention of a bishop and would bring no small amount of scandal to both families, because there are no paper certificates to be signed and filed away in a drawer. The memories of the people in the room must serve as the legal record. The neighbors or kin who stand watching from the corners of the room listen carefully, committing the exact phrasing to memory. To help solidify the memory of the event, a ceremonial drink is shared. The same wooden vessel that the parents passed around is refilled, perhaps this time with ale that has been warmed by the fire and sweetened with a spoonful of dark honey and a pinch of dried herbs. The cup is handed first to the young man, who takes a slow drink, and then he passes it directly to his new betrothed. She drinks from the same rough wooden rim, the warmth of the sweetened ale traveling down her throat, a comforting heat in the drafty room. This shared cup is a public demonstration of newly forged kinship, a physical blending of two households into a single shared interest. Words and warm ale are fleeting things, however, and medieval agreements require a physical token to serve as a lasting receipt of the promise. To mark the moment, a small silver coin is produced, often a groat, or a similar piece of small currency. The young man, or perhaps his father, places the coin on the edge of the heavy table, using a small tool or simply the pressure of strong thumbs against the hard oak. The silver is deliberately bent out of shape. Bending a coin is an old and common practice, a way of removing the silver from the ordinary flow of commerce and marking it as sacred to a vow. A warped coin cannot be spent at the market. It has been transformed into a permanent record of an oath. The young man presses the bent silver into the hand of his betrothed. She will keep it safe, likely folding it into a small scrap of undyed linen, or tucking it into a leather pouch tied at her waist, where she can feel its solid weight as she goes about her daily chores. With the silver pocketed and the cup set back upon the table, quiet finality settles over the room. The long weeks of careful maneuvering, the subtle inquiries made at the mill, the tense calculations of land and livestock, all of it is resolved. The parents can finally exhale their deep anxieties about the preservation of their holdings and their lineage resting easy for the night. The couple's path is now firmly charted, laid out before them like a freshly plowed field, waiting for the morning sun. Far above the freshly plowed fields and the thatched roofs of the villages, the atmosphere of courtship shifts entirely. Up on the high ridges, where the great stone castles of the nobility sit surrounded by thick curtain walls, marriage is utterly divorced from the rhythms of the harvest. Inside these vast, drafty halls, the air is cold, smelling faintly of wood ash, roasted meat, and damp limestone. To keep out the biting wind that whistles through the narrow arrow slits, the bare stone walls are hung with heavy tapestries. These thick woolen hangings absorb the chill and dampen the echoes of footsteps on the flagstones, creating pockets of quiet in the cavernous rooms. The people moving through these shadowed corridors experience the world through entirely different textures than the village folk below. Instead of the scratchy, undyed, coarse wool of the peasantry, the air here is filled with the soft rustle of heavy velvet and the stiff, deliberate glide of silk brocade. In the winter months, cloaks lined with squirrel, fox, and ermine brush against the carved wooden benches. The dyes of their garments are rich and deep madder reds, woad blues, and saffron yellows, colors that speak of immense wealth and long trade routes, worn by people whose daily routines involve very little physical labor. In this insulated world of furs and spices, marriage is not a matter of shared chores or mutual survival in a harsh winter. It is purely an instrument of statecraft. When the lord of a castle considers a match for his offspring, he is looking at maps and ledgers, not at the character of the prospective spouse. A marriage here is a bloodless treaty. It is used to secure a vulnerable border, to consolidate two standing armies, or to finally put an end to a generational blood feud between rival houses. The negotiations are carried out by emissaries, diplomats, and clerics who travel between estates, carrying sealed letters of parchment, debating the precise acreage of dowries and the shifting political loyalties of distant cousins. Because these alliances are so vital to the survival and expansion of a noble house, the arrangements cannot be left to chance or to the unpredictable emotions of young adults. Consequently, aristocratic betrothals often take place at an astonishingly young age. It is not uncommon for children to be formally pledged to one another before they can even read the treaties that bind them. A 3-year-old girl might be promised to a 5-year-old boy from a neighboring county, their future union securing a right-of-way through a vital mountain pass, or the taxation rights to a profitable toll bridge. These early betrothals are solemnized in quiet, formal ceremonies. The bewildered children sometimes stand in the great hall, dressed in miniature, restrictive versions of adult finery, prompted by their nurses to nod or repeat a simple memorized phrase in Latin. They do not understand the weight of the vows, nor are they expected to. After the documents are signed and sealed with drops of hot red wax, the children are usually sent back to their respective nurseries to grow up apart. They might not see each other again until they are teenagers, by which time the political landscape may have shifted, requiring the betrothal to be quietly dissolved by the church, so a more advantageous match can be made. There is a deep, pragmatic coldness to this process, mirroring the chill of the castle walls. The young nobles are raised with the absolute understanding that their bodies and their futures belong to their lineage. Love, if it is discussed at all, is considered a literary concept, something sung about by traveling troubadours in the evenings, accompanied by the gentle plucking of a lute. It is a pleasant fiction for entertainment, entirely separate from the serious, ledger-bound business of securing the family's power. The parents in these castles sleep just as deeply as the villagers once the negotiations are concluded, though their peace of mind comes from a different source. They rest in great wooden canopy beds, wrapped in fine linen sheets and heavy fur blankets, satisfied that their borders are secure, their alliances forged, and their legacy protected for another generation. But before those heavy velvet bed curtains are drawn shut for the night, the evening hours in the great hall offer a very different vision of romance. Once the long wooden trestle tables are cleared of the roasted meats, the trencher breads, and the remnants of the evening meal, the atmosphere in the stone room softens. The large hearth fires burn down to a steady, glowing orange. It is in this quiet, smoke-scented twilight that the songs of the troubadours echo against the high timber ceilings, accompanied by the slow, quiet plucking of a lute or the low drone of a viol. The musicians sit on low wooden stools, their fingers moving deliberately over gut strings, creating melodies that are repetitive, rhythmic, and soothing. The heavy wool tapestries hanging on the walls absorb the sharp echoes, making the music feel close and intimate, while hunting dogs sleep heavily on the stone floor, occasionally twitching in their dreams. The music is gentle, designed to wash over a well-fed audience, resting in the warmth of the fire. The songs they listen to are entirely about love, but it is a strange, stylized kind of love that bears absolutely no resemblance to the practical marriage contracts locked in the Lord's iron-bound chest. This is the realm of courtly love, a literary ideal of longing from afar. In the verses sung by the fire, a knight is always desperately devoted to a woman he cannot have, usually because she is married to someone else of higher station. The lyrics describe a formalized game of devotion. The knight suffers terribly from his affection, losing sleep and growing pale, sighing in the shade of a walled garden. The lady is distant, beautiful, and eternally out of reach, perhaps offering him only a silk ribbon or a dropped glove as a token of her favor. He wears this token in tournaments, fighting in her honor, while she remains a flawless, untouchable figure on a pedestal. It is an elaborate fiction, a performance of polite suffering, governed by strict poetic rules, where the pain of unrequited love is considered a noble, purifying force. There is a strict, universally understood divide between the romantic poetry recited for entertainment and the cold, dynastic reality of the lords and ladies who pay the musicians, the people weeping gracefully over a ballad of a knight dying for a stolen glance, are the very same people who, earlier that afternoon, traded a 12-year-old daughter for a stretch of fertile riverbank and a defensive alliance. They do not see this as a contradiction. For them, marriage is a vital, earthly business of property, grain, and survival, while love is an entirely separate, almost theoretical pursuit meant for songs and stories. You might see the lord and lady of the castle sitting side by side on high-backed chairs carved from dark oak, their feet resting on rushes that smell faintly of dried lavender and old listen in comfortable silence to tales of legendary knights who abandoned all duty and reason for the overwhelming power of love. Yet the lord and lady sit beside a spouse chosen entirely by political necessity, perhaps someone they had met only days before their own wedding. They might share a goblet of warm, spiced wine, passing the smooth metal between them, their heavy rings clinking softly against the silver. They are partners in the management of a small empire, bound by shared interests and mutual survival, rather than the swooning, desperate passion being sung about just a few feet away. They enjoy the fantasy of the music exactly because it is a fantasy. The chaotic, kingdom-destroying passion described by the troubadour is thrilling to hear about precisely because it is kept safely contained within the strings of the lute. In the actual daylight of their lives, such unchecked emotion would be disastrous, threatening the estates and bloodlines they work so hard to maintain. And so, as the final notes of the song fade into the stone walls and the firelight dims, they leave the romantic tragedies to the poets, walking quietly up the spiral stone stairs to their practical, secure, and carefully negotiated rest. When morning breaks and they rise from that rest, the reality of their status becomes immediately apparent in the sheer number of people who occupy their space. In the sprawling stone castles and manor houses of high society, privacy is an unimaginable luxury, and often an undesirable one. To be alone is to be vulnerable, and in the context of courtship, to be alone is to invite suspicion. A noble woman of marriageable age is a living vessel for her family's future wealth and political alliances, and such a valuable asset is never left unguarded. She moves through her days within a soft, suffocating cocoon of chaperones. From the moment the heavy oak shutters are opened to let in the dawn, she is surrounded by a shifting rotation of ladies-in-waiting, unwed aunts, younger sisters, and trusted nurses. When a prospective suitor is granted permission to visit, there is no quiet walk in an empty garden, no secluded corner of the hall left empty for their benefit. Courtship is a public exhibition conducted under the watchful, unblinking eyes of the court. The atmosphere in the receiving rooms is thick with a quiet, polite tension. The air carries the sweet, clean scent of rosewater, freshly sprinkled over the floor to sweeten the room, mixing with the heavy, warm fragrance of thick beeswax candles burning slowly in iron sconces. These expensive scents serve a dual purpose, masking both the damp chill of the stone walls and the nervous energy of two people trying to navigate a conversation while surrounded by a silent audience. The suitor and the young woman sit at a respectable distance from one another, perhaps on a carved wooden bench or upon velvet cushions placed near the hearth. All around them, the machinery of the household continues. In the corners of the room, the ladies in waiting sit quietly on low stools. Their hands are perpetually busy with embroidery, drawing brightly colored silk threads through taut linen. They are trained to keep their faces serene and their eyes directed demurely toward the floor. But their presence is a solid, impenetrable wall. They hear every word spoken, note every pause, and observe the exact distance maintained between the suitor and the lady. Under this intense surveillance, conversations are carefully measured and exceedingly formal. They discuss safe, predictable topics: the health of distant relatives, the success of the recent harvest, the changing of the seasons, or the subtle details of a tapestry on the wall. Any true courtship must happen in the narrow spaces between these ordinary words. A suitor learns to convey his intentions through a slightly longer glance, a respectful tilt of the head, or the deliberate choice of a harmless phrase. He knows he is not just speaking to the woman in front of him, but auditioning for the silent embroiderers who will report every detail to her parents. Because spoken words are so heavily monitored, written correspondence becomes the vital artery of a highborn courtship. The physical exchange of these letters is a delicate and highly orchestrated maneuver. A suitor might spend hours composing a brief message, writing carefully on a small, stiff square of parchment. This parchment is then folded tightly, sealed with a drop of wax, and entrusted to a servant. The dim, drafty corridors between the great hall and the bedchambers become the staging ground for these silent exchanges. A trusted servant, well compensated for their loyalty and their silence, receives the folded parchment pressed quickly into their palm as the suitor departs. The servant then carries the letter hidden deep within the folds of a woolen cloak or tucked securely up a wide sleeve, waiting for the right moment to pass it to the lady. Reading the letter requires finding a rare fraction of solitude in a crowded life. The lady might step toward a narrow, deep-set window, turning her back to the room under the pretense of catching the afternoon light to examine a piece of thread. There, shielded for only a moment by her own posture, she breaks the wax seal and reads the ink. It is a life lived entirely on a stage, where the constant presence of others is simply accepted as the natural order of things, the necessary price of their rank, and the heavy burden of their inheritance. Yet, despite all these layers of surveillance and familial control, there existed a quiet, radical piece of ecclesiastical law that undermined the authority of every parent and guardian. The church maintained a doctrine that frustrated kings, lords, and prosperous merchants alike: the absolute necessity of free consent. Beneath the ledgers, the dowry chests, and the watchful eyes of chaperones, canon law held that a marriage was not made by the exchange of property. It was not made by the blessing of a priest. It was not made by the permission of a father. It was made solely by the mutual consent of the man and the woman. The mechanism was remarkably simple, relying entirely on the specific tense of the words spoken. If a couple exchanged vows using words of present consent, what theologians called verba de praesenti, they were instantly and indissolubly married. A man needed only to look at a woman and say, "I take you as my wife," and she to reply, "I take you as my husband." If those words were spoken freely, with the genuine intention to unite, the deed was legally done. There was no waiting period, no necessary paperwork, and no requirement for the heavy oak doors of a cathedral to open for them. Because of this simple standard, marriages did not only happen at the altar, they happened in damp meadows, while tending sheep, in the quiet corners of alehouses smelling of sour yeast and wood smoke, by village wells at twilight, and in the shadow of the hawthorn hedgerows. A couple might join hands over a scarred wooden table, or exchange a simple token to mark the moment. They might use a bent silver penny, a ring carved from horn, a piece of ribbon, or simply a circle woven from river rushes, while speaking the binding words, even without a witness. The church considered the union completely valid in the eyes of God, though proving it in an earthly court without onlookers was a difficult matter. This theological stance created immense and continuous friction across medieval society. for families who viewed marriage primarily as a tool for consolidating wealth, securing trade routes, or merging plots of arable land. The Church's law of consent was a constant, looming threat. A father might spend a decade negotiating a lucrative match for his daughter, arranging the transfer of cattle, embroidered linens, and silver spoons, only to discover that she had secretly exchanged vows of present consent with a neighbor's son behind the dovecote. Once those words were spoken, the carefully constructed financial arrangements simply crumbled. The Church did not necessarily encourage these clandestine marriages. Priests preached regularly against the sin of marrying in secret outside the church porch and without the public reading of the bans. A couple who married privately in a tavern or an orchard could be fined or assigned public penance for bypassing the proper community rituals. But the ecclesiastical courts were unyielding on the central point. The marriage itself, however illicitly formed, was entirely valid and permanent. The Church punished the secrecy, but they upheld the union. Because the stakes were so high, church courts were constantly filled with disputes over what exactly had been said in a quiet moment months prior. In rooms smelling of damp wool cloaks and old parchment, neighbors and eavesdroppers were called to testify about grammar and tense. The scratching of the clerk's quill recorded endless debates over exact phrasing. Did he say, "I will take you," which was merely a promise for the future? Or did he say, "I take you," which bound them forever? Families would drag young couples before the bishop, bringing forth witnesses who claimed the words were spoken in jest, or under duress, or while clouded by strong ale. Yet, amidst the endless parade of witnesses and the desperate attempts of parents to annul inconvenient matches, the fundamental rule remained intact. It was a singular space in medieval life where the individual will of a peasant girl carried the exact same theological weight as the will of a noblewoman, as long as the consent was free and the words were rooted in the present moment. The heavy machinery of family expectation could be halted entirely by a few quiet syllables spoken in the dark. When the day's labor finally ended, as the sun dipped behind the tree line, and the smoke from the village hearths began to settle low over the thatched roofs, a couple might slip away to speak those very syllables. They would leave the watchful eyes of the parish and the busy oversight of their parents, walking quietly out past the edge of the cultivated fields and into the fading twilight. The boundary lines of the village were often marked by thick, tangled hawthorn hedges, or the deep, spreading shadows of ancient oak trees. As the air grew cool, the smell of damp earth, wet leaves, and crushed clover rose around them when they stepped off the beaten path. This was the quiet landscape of the clandestine vow. There were no altars out here, no velvet cushions, no ledgers tracking the transfer of a dowry. There was only the dimming light of evening and the rustle of dry branches in the cooling wind. Sometimes they brought a single, nervous friend to stand nearby in the dusk. This companion might shift from foot to foot in the wet grass, serving as the sole human witness to the exchange, peering into the shadows while the couple joined hands. Other times, they brought no one at all, trusting their promises entirely to the quiet countryside. Standing face to face beneath the canopy of an oak or pressed against the shelter of the hedgerow, they would speak the necessary words of present consent. "I take thee to my wife," he might say, his voice kept low against the evening breeze. "I take thee to my husband," she would answer. In the span of those two sentences, the world shifted entirely, without banns being read from the pulpit, without a priest's blessing, without the exchange of silver or the signing of parchment. They were now irrevocably married. It was an act of profound, quiet rebellion. It stripped away the social machinery of the village matchmaker and the careful economic calculations of their elders, reducing the vast, heavy institution of marriage to its absolute, barest minimum. To ensure this new bond was entirely indissoluble, it had to be consummated. The spoken vows created the marriage, but the physical union secured it, cementing the contract in a way the church courts would fiercely defend. They would lie down together right there in the damp evening grass, or perhaps retreat a short distance to the quiet, dusty shelter of a nearby hayloft. It was not a comfortable or luxurious affair. The reality of these unions involved the heavy, scratchy wool of everyday tunics, the dampness of the ground seeping slowly through their hose, and the sharp chill of the night air on exposed skin. If they found a barn, the air would be thick with the scent of dried winter fodder, old wood, and settling dust. It was hasty, hidden, and intensely private. Yet this physical act, performed on the uneven earth or atop a pile pile of rough hay carried the exact same legal and spiritual permanence as a union consummated between fine linen sheets in a lord's bedchamber. When it was done, they would straighten their clothing, brushing the hay or the loose soil from their wool. They might shiver slightly in the deepening night as they began the walk back toward the warm glow of the village fires. They returned looking exactly as they had left, appearing to the world as two unmarried young people heading home from a twilight stroll. No bells rang to announce their change in status. No feast awaited them at the hearth. The risk they had taken was immense. If they were discovered by the wrong neighbor, there would be angry parents, neighborhood scandal, and small fines in the local courts for bypassing the proper public channels. If one of them later decided to deny the event, the single nervous witness, if they had one at all, would be all that stood between a valid marriage and a ruined reputation. But for that night, as they slipped back into their separate family homes and laid down on their familiar straw pallets, they held a secret knowledge. They had taken their fates entirely into their own hands, bound together by nothing more than whispered words and the damp earth. While some couples chose the shadows, binding themselves in the quiet of the night, the church vastly preferred the bright, unyielding light of public scrutiny. For a marriage to be fully recognized by the parish and to avoid the heavy fines and social suspicion that clung to clandestine vows, the community had to be informed. The private agreements made in parlors and fields had to be brought before the village. This was the purpose of the banns. Imagine the parish church on a Sunday morning. The air inside is thick with the scent of melting tallow, damp wool, and the slow, lingering smoke of incense. The stone floors are cold beneath the feet of the congregation, who stand closely packed together in the nave. At a specific point in the Mass, the priest would turn away from the altar and face the parishioners. He would shift from the rhythmic, chanted Latin of the liturgy into the plain, everyday language of the village. As he did, a distinct hush would fall over the stone church. This practice, made mandatory by the Fourth Lateran Council in the early 13th century, was designed to bring the hidden workings of courtship into the open air. For 3 consecutive Sundays, the priest would read aloud the names of those intending to marry. He would state their names clearly, letting the syllables carry to the back of the church, where the poorer family stood, and to the front, wealthier merchants or local gentry sat. He was asking, formally and legally, if anyone knew of any impediment as to why these two people should not be joined in holy matrimony. The silence that followed the reading of the names was heavy and deliberate. The village was listening closely, not merely out of an appetite for gossip, but because they served as the living memory of the parish. In a world with few written records, the community acted as both witnesses and an archive. They knew who was related to whom, who had stood as godparent to which child, and who had been seen whispering in the orchards with someone else just a few months prior. This was the opportunity for the aggrieved to step forward. A jilted lover might raise their voice from the back of the church, claiming that the groom had already promised himself to them during the last harvest, because a spoken promise of marriage was legally binding. This prior contract, if proven, would invalidate the new arrangement entirely. The church court would have to investigate, calling witnesses to recount exactly what words had been exchanged over a flagon of ale or beside a hedgerow. Other objections were less romantic and more pragmatic. Someone might point out that the bride and groom shared a great-grandparent, falling within the forbidden degrees of consanguinity. Sometimes the objection was not about blood, but about spiritual kinship. If the groom's father had stood as godfather to the bride, they were considered spiritually related, a bond just as strictly regulated by the church as biological ties. Economic grievances were also aired in this quiet space. A master might object that his apprentice had not yet finished his term of service and was therefore not free to marry. An unpaid creditor might speak up, refusing to let a man take on the financial burdens of a new household, while his previous debts at the mill or the blacksmith remained unresolved. In this way, the reading of the banns acted as a slow, methodical clearing of social debts before a new household could be officially recognized. The 3-week period provided a necessary buffer. It was time for the community to digest the impending change, to settle old grievances, and to ensure that the fabric of the village would not be torn by the union. If a debt needed paying, it was paid. If a previous entanglement needed untangling, it was addressed in the cold light of day. By the time the third Sunday arrived, if the priest read the names and was met with nothing but the shuffling of feet and the quiet breathing of the congregation. The path was finally clear. The couple had survived the scrutiny of their neighbors. Their pasts had been audited and found acceptable, and the machinery of the village was ready to accept them as a new, permanent fixture in the parish. While the bans were being read and the public faced its final opportunity to object, private life continued in a steady, domestic rhythm of preparation. Long before the negotiations had settled the transfer of a dairy cow or the boundaries of a plowed field, another kind of wealth had been quietly accumulating in the corner of the bride's family home. This was the trousseau, the collection of linens and garments a young woman was expected to bring into her new marriage. It was not something hastily gathered in the final weeks before a wedding, but rather the slow, inevitable result of years of quiet, repetitive labor. The foundation of this chest lay in the flax fields and the spinning wheel, or more commonly, the simple drop spindle. From the time she was a young girl, a woman's hands were rarely idle. The rhythmic whir of the spindle was the constant background noise of the medieval home, a sound that filled the long, dark evenings by the hearth and the bright, breezy afternoons sitting by the open doorway. She would draw out the raw, combed flax fibers from the distaff, tucked tightly under her arm, dampening the pale strands slightly with her fingers or her lips to keep the fibers smooth. With a flick of her wrist, she sent the spindle twirling toward the floor, twisting the loose fibers into fine, strong linen thread. It was a meditative task, one that required an automatic muscle memory built over thousands of hours, turning the rough harvest of the fields into smooth, continuous spools of thread. This thread accumulated slowly, wound into tight skeins, waiting for the loom. Depending on the wealth of the family, the thread might be woven at home on a heavy timber frame or taken to a local professional to be turned into broad, heavy lengths of cloth. The fabric produced was not delicate or decorative. It was dense, durable linen, woven tight enough to block the drafts of a winter night, meant to withstand decades of boiling, beating, and scrubbing with harsh, ash-based lye soaps. This cloth would become the physical boundary between the couple and the cold world. It would be cut and sewn into the deep, enveloping bedsheets they would sleep between, and the plain, functional undergarments wear against their skin every day of their lives. The linen gathered in her youth was intended to stretch far into her future, serving domestic purposes she could only anticipate. There were lengths of soft, repeatedly bleached cloth set aside to become swaddling bands, ready to tightly wrap the infants that would eventually arrive in the new household. There were sturdy, coarse towels for the wash basin, heavy cloths for the proving of bread dough, and perhaps even the plain, unadorned lengths that would one day serve as winding sheets for the dead. Every stage of household life, from birth to the final laying out of the body, was wrapped in the linen that a woman had spun in her girlhood. As the cloth was finished, it was carefully folded and laid into a heavy wooden chest. These chests were often built of oak or elm, constructed with thick iron hinges and a sturdy lock designed to keep out dampness and mice. This chest was a substantial piece of furniture that would travel with her on a cart to her new home, holding the entirety of her material contribution. To protect the precious fabric from the ever-present threat of clothes moths, the layers of folded linen were interleaved with dried herbs, stiff sprigs of lavender, pungent leaves of rue, and curling shavings of sharp-smelling cedar were tucked carefully into the deep corners and between the heavy folds. The herbs had been gathered in late summer, hung from the rafters to dry, and now served as a fragrant barrier against decay. When the heavy lid of the chest was lifted, the scent that rose from it was clean, medicinal, and sharply fragrant, a smell that meant preservation, order, and care. In the final days before the wedding, as the village prepared for the feast, there was a quiet satisfaction in organizing this chest. A woman might kneel before it on the packed earth floor, pressing down the tall stacks of fabric to make room for one more linen shift or one more bundled towel. Running a hand over the smooth, cool surface of the tightly woven cloth, she could feel the dense, heavy weight of her own history. Each thread was a record of an afternoon spent spinning, of a quiet conversation held by the fire, of a long winter outlasted. The chest was full. The linens were fragrant and crisp, and the long, slow work of her early life was finally ready to be carried across the threshold into a household of her own. With the chest securely fastened, the quiet, solitary work of the previous years gave way to the communal labor of the weeks just before the wedding. First came the brewing of the bride ale. In the damp, shadowed outbuildings, the air grew thick with the rich, earthy scent of fermenting malt. The preparation of the ale was not a hurried task, but a slow, careful process that required constant tending. Barley was soaked and left to sprout, then dried and ground before being steeped in large wooden vats of hot water. The women of the village worked together, stirring the heavy mash with long wooden paddles, their movements steady and rhythmic in the dim light. As the yeast was pitched, a soft, continuous bubbling began to fill the quiet spaces of the brewhouse, a low murmur of transformation that would last for days. The sweet, heavy smell of the liquid drifted across the yard, settling into the damp earth and the coarse wool of their clothing. This bride ale, strong and plentiful, would eventually be sold to the wedding guests to help the newly married couple establish their household, a practical foundation built on shared labor and shared drink. In the final days, the focus shifted to the communal oven. Long before the sun broke over the horizon, while the morning air was still sharp and cool, the fires were banked, and the heavy stone of the oven was brought to a fierce, radiating heat. Women gathered with large wooden troughs, their arms plunged deep into mounds of coarse flour and water, kneading the stiff dough. There was a quiet comfort in the repetitive motion, the pressing and folding of the heavy mixture in the dim morning light. They shaped the dough into large, flat loaves, the kind of dense, hearty bread that could sustain a village through hours of celebration. As the loaves were slid onto the hot stones with long wooden peels, the intense heat pushed back the morning chill, filling the air with the deep, comforting aroma of toasted grain and baking yeast. The bread emerged dark and crusty, stacked in great, warm piles on wooden tables, smelling of wood smoke and sustenance. When the morning of the wedding finally arrived, there was no solitary seclusion for the bride, and no delicate white gown to step into. Instead, she dressed in the familiar comfort of her best everyday kirtle, the wool thick and dyed in whatever rich color her family could afford. Perhaps a deep russet or a soft, faded blue. The fabric was practical, meant to be worn long after the wedding day had passed. But today, it was brushed clean of ash and dust, the heavy skirts falling in neat, familiar folds around her ankles. To mark the importance of the morning, she might pin on a new set of laced sleeves, the fresh fabric contrasting against the heavier wool of her gown, tightly bound from wrist to elbow with thin cord. Over her hair, she smoothed a freshly bleached linen coif, the white fabric crisp and bright against her skin, smelling faintly of lye soap and the open air where it had dried in the sun. The clothing was simple, grounded in the realities of her daily life, yet elevated by the quiet care taken in its arrangement. The final adornment was woven from the fields and gardens rather than spun from the loom. Sitting in the morning light, the women twisted together simple, fragrant crowns to be worn upon the heads of both the bride and the groom. They took strong, woody sprigs of rosemary, bending them carefully into circles, the crushed needles leaving a sticky resin on their fingers and releasing a sharp, pine-like scent into the air. Into the rosemary, they wove stalks of dried wheat, the heavy, golden heads nodding against the green, a quiet symbol of a household that would not know hunger. Depending on the season, they might thread small wildflowers through the stems, adding flecks of pale color to the rustic bands. The work was slow and tactile, the rough stems pressing into their palms as they bound the ends with twine. When the crowns were finished, they rested on the table, smelling of the earth and the turning seasons, ready to mark the threshold between the life that had been and the one that was about to begin. When the morning finally arrived, the couple wore these woven crowns as they walked together toward the parish church. The ground was often damp with early dew, their leather turnshoes softening slightly as they navigated the familiar dirt paths of the village. They did not walk down a quiet interior aisle to begin their wedding. Instead, the procession halted before it ever entered the building. The marriage ceremony itself took place outside, standing on the stone porch of the church under the open sky. The church door had long served as the traditional place for legal agreements, public declarations, and the settling of debts. It was the boundary between the secular world of the village and the sacred space within. Gathering on the worn stone steps, the wedding party stood in the daylight, surrounded by neighbors, extended family, and any passers-by who chose to stop and watch. The heavy wooden doors of the church remained shut behind the priest, who stood waiting on the porch in his vestments. The air outside carried the ordinary, uninterrupted sounds of the morning. A wooden cart rattling down the road, distant bleating of livestock, the low hum of voices, pressing close to hear the proceedings. Before any vows of devotion were spoken, there was the necessary and unhurried matter of property. Marriage was, at its core, a transfer of goods, labor, and responsibilities, and the church porch served as a living public registry. The priest, or sometimes a local clerk, with a piece of parchment, would read the dowry arrangements aloud to the assembled crowd. He spoke clearly and deliberately, ensuring that every person present understood exactly what was changing hands. He would list the provisions slowly. He spoke of acres of arable land, the boundaries marked by old oak trees or stone walls. He listed the household goods, the heavy copper cooking pots, the stacked woolen blankets, the lengths of bleached linen, the wooden chests. He counted out the sheep, the laying hens, or the handful of silver coins that the bride brought with her. He also detailed the dower lands the groom promised for her support, a designated portion of his own property that would belong to her should she outlive him. It was a purely practical accounting, stated plainly in the open air, so that the entire community could serve as witnesses to the contract. If a dispute arose years later, these neighbors would be called upon to remember what was said on the church steps. Once the financial realities were settled, acknowledged by the nods of the families and the quiet murmurs of the crowd, the priest turned his attention to the couple. The vows they exchanged were simple, direct, and spoken in the local language rather than in Latin, so there could be no misunderstanding of the promises being made. They took each other by the right hand, their palms touching, the rough twine of their rustic crowns resting lightly on their heads as they spoke the binding words. Then came the ring. For most common folk, it was rarely a piece of great monetary value. It might be fashioned from a simple band of base metal, like bronze, copper, or iron, polished until it gleamed dull and smooth in the light. In poorer villages, it might be carved patiently from bone or animal horn, sanded down until it slipped easily over the knuckle. The groom held the plain circlet and began a deliberate, rhythmic ritual, guided by the priest. He touched the cold metal of the ring first to the tip of the bride's thumb, naming the father. He moved it to her index finger, naming the son. He touched it to her middle finger, naming the Holy Ghost. Finally, he slid the band down onto her third finger where it would stay. It was a long-held belief that a small, delicate vein ran directly from this specific finger straight up the arm and into the heart, physically binding the simple token to the center of her life and breath. With the ring placed and the final words of the outdoor rite spoken, the legal and communal work of the marriage was complete. The crowd shifted, letting out a collective exhale of breath, wool garments rustling in the morning air. The priest turned and pushed open the heavy, iron-studded doors of the church. As the thick wood swung inward on its hinges, the bright daylight of the porch gave way to the cool, cavernous shadows of the nave. From the depths of the stone interior, the rich, heavy scent of burning incense and melting beeswax drifted out to meet them, leaving the noise of the village behind. The newly married couple stepped over the threshold, moving out of the open air and into the quiet, fragrant dark of the church to hear the nuptial mass. When the mass concluded and the long hours of feasting and dancing finally began to wind down, the sky above the village would deepen into the heavy, star-strewn dark of a medieval night. The transition from the public celebration to the private reality of the marriage was not sudden, nor was it a quiet slipping away. Instead, it was marked by a noisy, torchlit procession. Friends, family, and neighbors gathered in the cool night air, lighting torches of pitch and resin that cast long, flickering shadows against the wattle and daub walls of the houses. The air filled with the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat from the lingering feast, mingling with the damp, earthy scent of the village lanes. The community walked with the newlyweds through the dark, their voices raised in song and chorus, good-natured jests. The sound of heavy leather boots and wooden soles struck the packed dirt of the path, a steady, collective rhythm moving toward the couple's home. In a world where survival depended on the strength of the community, a marriage was never merely the union of two individuals, but a shift in the fabric of the village itself. And so, the village escorted them to the very threshold of their new life, carrying the warmth and noise of the celebration all the way to the door of the bedchamber. Inside the house, the procession did not stop at the door. The crowd pressed into the sleeping quarters, filling the small space with the heat of many bodies and the smoke of torches and tallow candles. The couple was prepared for bed, shedding their wedding finery for simple, unbleached linen shifts. They climbed into the high wooden bed, sitting up against pillows stuffed with goose down or straw, depending on their wealth. The bed itself was a substantial piece of furniture, often the most valuable item in the household, built to keep out the drafts of winter, and strung tightly with ropes to support a thick feather or flock mattress. Once the couple was settled beneath the heavy woolen blankets, the village priest stepped forward. He carried a small vessel of holy water and a sprig of hyssop or a small brush. With a series of calm, rhythmic motions, he sprinkled the holy water over the bed and the couple, reciting a blessing to ensure peace, fertility, and protection from the unseen dangers of the night. The drops of water settled lightly on the coarse wool of the blankets, smelling faintly of the stone font of the church, while beneath the bed, dried herbs like meadowsweet and lavender had been scattered across the floorboards to sweeten the air of the crowded room. Before the crowd dispersed, a final cup was brought to the bed. This was often a warm, spiced wine, sweetened with honey and flavored with whatever precious spices the family could afford. Perhaps a trace of cinnamon, clove, or ginger. The heavy earthenware or pewter cup was passed first to the bride, then to the groom, the warm liquid offering a brief, comforting heat against the chill of the room. The cup was sometimes passed among the closest attendants as well, a shared drink that served as a final, physical seal on the long rituals of the day. With the wine finished and the blessings spoken, the time finally came for the community to withdraw. The jests faded into quiet murmurs of good night. One by one, the neighbors and family members filed out of the chamber, carrying their candles and torches with them. The heavy wool and linen curtains that surrounded the bed were pulled shut along their wooden rings, enclosing the couple in a small, dark, draft-free space of their own. The thick wooden door of the chamber was pulled shut, the iron latch dropping into place with a dull, heavy clack. Outside, the footsteps of the village slowly receded down the lane, the light of the torches fading into the distance until the night swallowed them completely. The fires in the hearths burned down to glowing red embers, settling into soft gray ash. The noise of the day, the complex negotiations, the feasts, and the crowded processions all fell away, leaving only the sound of the wind against the thatched roof the distant bark of a dog and the deep, unbroken quiet of the sleeping village.